even if it isn't over, but by saying it's over, that itself will help to make it end. The topic, the pursuit of truth. Our sages tell us that there's no truth but Torah. Torah is the only absolute truth. And it stands to reason because Torah is God's wisdom. And if God is the ultimate truth, so is his wisdom. But Torah is not just a subject. Torah is also a goal to reach a certain level of consciousness. And in order to reach a heightened state of consciousness, which is the ultimate state of truth, you have to go through different stages. So our sages, the rabbis of the Mishnah and the Talmud, developed a system, and it's in Ethics of the Fathers. Ethics of the Fathers is the famous Talmudic work that deals with ethics, as the name suggests. And the last chapter has a title called Kinyan Torah, the acquisition of Torah. And in that chapter, it has one paragraph that speaks of the 48 ways of acquiring Torah. Now you can read this on page 1. Torah is greater than priesthood and royalty. See, in Judaism, the role of the priest, the Kohen, was a very special, heightened role, who served in the temple. The king, the monarch, was considered to be the greatest leader of the people, and hopefully would be also a great spiritual source of inspiration. Not always, that didn't work out that way. But when we're talking about priesthood and royalty, royalty is acquired with 30 distinctions. Literally, the word should be levels, which we translate as levels or steps. There are 30 steps or levels to reach the heightened level of royalty. And the priesthood requires 24 levels. But we're not going to go into those. But for one to acquire Torah, he must have the following 48 qualities. And literally, the word here is either things or matters, 48 matters. And I'm listing only 8. The reason for that is because we have 6 weeks. And simple arithmetic tells you that if you do 8 each week, we'll finish it in 6 weeks. That's the hope. And before we start discussing these 8 items, I just want to mention there's a significance to the number 48 in Judaism. Numbers are very significant. What is there in Judaism relates to the number 48? The Talmud tells us there were 48 prophets. So we know that prophecy is associated with the number 48. Abraham was 48 years old when he developed his whole ideology of monotheism. It started at the age of 3 when he started to search what is God, where is God, and it ended when he was 48 years old. In the Torah, the word well, a well, is mentioned 48 times. The Mishkan, the tabernacle in the desert, had 48 boards. The word Eshet Chayil, the woman of valor, the word Chayil, valor, adds up to 48. Between Passover and Shavuot, we count 49 days. Well, it's not 48, that's 49. But there's a connection between them. And Maharal, the great Jewish leader and scholar and Kabbalist of the 16th century, 17th century, said that during this period of 49 days, they correspond to the 48 different levels over here. And I guess the way it's understood by subsequent authorities that each day corresponds to one of these 48, and the last day is all of the 48 combined. I guess the idea behind that is that sometimes when a person goes from one step to another, when you graduate from one level to another, you forget about the first level. But the first level still has very important meaning and relevance that we shouldn't forget. So the last day we go through all 48 combined. So that's how we get to number 49. What does all this point to? It points to the fact that 48 represents something spiritual, prophets, the age of Abraham, who developed an understanding, a mature understanding of monotheism. Wells are a symbol and a metaphor for knowledge that comes up from the bottom up and gives us a higher level of understanding and consciousness. The boards of the Mishkan, the boards were there to create a sanctuary for God. The word board in Hebrew, keresh, has the letters of sheker, of falsehood, and kesher, a bond, that we transform the falsehood of the world into a bond with God. And the counting of the Omer, which we did between Passover and Shavuot, was all about refining ourselves. So the number 48, and the woman of valor, of course, is about the righteousness of women who are developing to the point where they reached this 48th and 49th level, and actually the 50th level. But I just wanted to mention that the number 48 has significance in Judaism. In fact, all numbers have significance, but some have more than others. Now, if you look at the text itself, when it talks about priesthood and royalty, it talks about 30 steps. That's the literal translation. There are 30 or 24 steps. When it talks about Torah, it's 48 matters or things. What's the difference? The difference is, as commentaries point out, that when you want to acquire you have a certain goal, an ambition in life, but you have to do certain things. You can't just jump from the bottom to the top. You have to go through various steps and stages. But it's only a means to an end. There's nothing substantive, there's nothing intrinsically valuable about the means, except for the fact that it gets you to the end. But in Judaism, when it comes to the pursuit of truth, which is the pursuit of Torah, to develop this Torah consciousness, every step is an end. Even if you never reach the 48th, if you only mastered number 1, you have something of substance. You're not just going on a path that will ultimately get you to where you want to go. So if you don't reach the end, you have nothing. You're left without anything. No, every step has value. That's why when we count the days from Passover to Shavuot, we don't say today is first day, today is the second day, or third day, or fourth day. We say today is one day, today is 2 days, today is 3 days. What does that mean? That when you have the third day, it's not just the third day, it's 3 days. You have 3 days in your backpack. You have it in you. You never lose that, even if you don't reach the pinnacle. Another thing about the term acquiring Torah. What is the definition of acquiring? It says in the Talmud that the Hebrew word for an old person is zakein. Zakein is old. So the Talmud says, no, that's not what zakein means. Zakein it has 3 words in it. Zeh, let me see if I can write it. Technology. That's the first letter of zakein. And the second one is kana. And the third one is chachma. So the word zakein is supposed to stand for zeh. There are no vowels in the Torah, so the K is kana, acquired. But where's the C for chachma? It's not there. Zakein is someone who acquires wisdom. But where is the word wisdom in the word zakein? And the answer is the only thing you could truly acquire is wisdom. The only thing that really becomes part of you is wisdom. If you buy a car, is the car part of you? the house part of you? Whatever item you buy, is that part of you? No. The only thing that becomes an integral part of you is wisdom. So, by definition, acquiring really means that you have something that becomes part of you, and that's the only thing that can become part of you. It truly, although we use the word acquiring for everything, the real definition of acquisition is someone who acquires knowledge, wisdom and knowledge. We're not going into the difference between wisdom and knowledge. I know some people might be tempted to go into the differences between different levels of knowledge, but that will take us off the subject. Okay, so now we have to find what are these 48 methods of acquiring wisdom, acquiring the wisdom of Torah, which is the ultimate manifestation of truth. So the first one is Talmud. What does the word Talmud mean? And because most commentators are Jewish, they have different opinions, which is part of being Jewish, and it's part of learning Torah, that you can have many different interpretations of the same thing, and they could all be valid. It could also all be invalid. They could all be wrong, but they could also be right. One definition given by Rabbi David HaNagid, who was a grandson of Maimonides. Maimonides had a son who was very great, Abraham, and he had a grandson, David, who was famous as well. Not like his grandfather, but he was very well known. And he says that it simply means literally the study of Talmud. That if you want to acquire wisdom, you have to have a vast knowledge of Talmud. You can't just be limited to one subject. You have to cover the Talmud is often referred to as a sea, the sea of the Talmud. But most other commentators say, no, that's not really what he's talking about. It's obvious that you have to study the text of the Torah, which includes the Talmud, but it means that you have to learn from a teacher. The word for learning is limud. Talmud means that you have to get it from a teacher. And that's what's unique about Jewish knowledge throughout history. Throughout Jewish history, there was never a time where one was an autodidact, where one studied from text on his own without having a teacher. Yes, there are people who didn't have many teachers, but they have to have at least someone who transmits the knowledge from an earlier generation. That's why the oral Torah is so important in Judaism. And even after the oral Torah was put into writing in the Mishnah and the Talmud, there's still an oral tradition to this day where everyone learns from a teacher, not just taking out a book out of the library. Today you can get books where everything is translated into English. The whole Talmud is translated into English and other languages. And theoretically, you could take a volume out of the library and read it on your own. And if you have a good understanding of any subject, you could master the Talmud. But you don't really have the Talmud. You have to have a teacher, because the teacher gives you more than just the translation and the simple meaning, but the teacher is able to project certain nuances, certain flavors, certain colors that cannot be captured just by reading a book. Books could be very misleading when you don't have the right approach to transmitting that knowledge. I think I gave this example not too long ago. The most basic belief of Judaism is the belief in one God. There's nothing more basic to Judaism than that belief. Even more than belief in God. It's half in jest. They tell the story of this atheist Jewish father who sends his kid to a Catholic school because they had the best educational program. And the kid comes back talking about the Trinity. And the father says that we are Jews. There's only one God, and we don't believe in him. So belief in one God is the most basic Jewish belief. And where does it come from? The most famous verse in the whole Torah, the Shema. Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord is one. And yet, in Christianity, they interpret that verse to mean that there's a Trinity. Because God's name is mentioned 3 times, that means there's a Trinity. So you can take the most basic teaching of Judaism, and it could be distorted to read the opposite of what it really means. That's because you could read a book any way you like. And therefore, you have to have a teacher of Torah. That's what the word Talmud over here means. If you want to accomplish in master and reach the ultimate truth, you have to have a connection to the previous generation. There has to be an unbroken chain from Mount Sinai to the present day and age, which there is, and we all have to become part of that chain. Some people, some commentaries say Talmud actually means you have to always be a student. The Hebrew word for scholar is not chacham, which means wise, but Talmud chacham, the student of the scholar. What about if you're the teacher? What about if you're the most learned person in the world? You still have to be a student. You can never just be a teacher. If you stop learning, you're no longer able to reach the goal of capturing truth. That's so important that we're always learning. I remember when the Rabbi suffered a heart attack, and for months the doctors were very concerned about his health because he had a massive heart attack, so they didn't want him to exert himself. And the Rebbe decided he wanted to go to the gravesite of his father-in-law, which he did frequently, twice a week actually, to pray for all the people who ask him for blessings. And it's a lot of exertion for him to travel there, and he would stand there for 5, 6, 7 hours without any. He would fast that day, and the doctors were really very worried, and they told him that they don't think he should go. And he said, no, I have to go. And then they said, well, let's send in some old rabbis who were older than the Rebbe. The Rebbe was then 77 years old. So they took some rabbis who were in the 80s, great scholars, and the Rebbe would have respect for them. And they didn't tell him not to go. They just came into the room and they said, Rebbe, we need you. We can't lose you. So the Rebbe responded, just like you need a Rebbe, I need a Rebbe. But out of respect for them, he delayed going for a week. Now here you have the top rabbi in the world, person who the greatest scholars would come for guidance and for learning, for everything. He's on top of the world of knowledge, of scholarship. But yet he felt that he could even risk his life because he needed to have his teacher. How he communicated with someone who was not in this physical world, that's a separate subject which we won't go into. But that just illustrates and dramatizes this point. That thing is a mistake. It's a typo. The next part, it belongs to another subject. Okay, so we know what Talmud means. Now we get to attentive listening. Literally, it's hearing of the ear. So here again, there are several interpretations. One says, listen before asking questions. Jews love to ask questions. And it's a very positive thing. It's something that's greatly encouraged. But before a person asks a question, they have to listen to what is being said. Some say that the word hearing of the ear isn't hearing by definition of the ear, because the Hebrew word for hearing is shema. What does the word shema mean? Hearing. Hear, O Israel. But it doesn't only mean hear, it also means understand. Meditate, reflect. So you would think if it says that the next step is to hear, it would mean you have to try to understand what you just studied. And here he says, no. Before you get to that level, the first thing is you have to hear. You have to be receptive to what is being taught without you trying to analyze what you've been taught. There's a discussion in the Torah. It's a very interesting and an unparalleled story in the book of Leviticus, where Moses has a debate with his brother Aaron about the laws of the sacrifices. It's like a Talmudic debate. It's in the biblical text. And Aaron argues with Moses, and Moses, it says, Vayishma Moshe, and Moshe listened, Vayita be'enav, and he liked it. It was good in his eyes. He accepted that he was wrong and Aaron was right. But what does it mean when it says Moses listened and he liked the idea? So I once had to speak at a certain place, and to my very great dismay, one of the top speakers in the world, Jewish speakers in the world, was present. and he was going to come to my talk. And I felt very, very intimidated by him. So I told him that. I said, "You're going to come to listen to me speak, and you're the..." So he said, he quoted this verse, and he says, Moshe listened, and he liked the idea of listening, because Moses was always the speaker. He's always talking. And once in his life, he had to listen to what another rabbi taught him. And Moses says, "You know what? I like this. This is fun to be on the listening side. It's not a bad thing." So this rabbi told me, "You know what? I always speak all over the world, but you know what? I like to listen also. I want to hear what you have to say." That's very important, that a person who's trying to pursue truth should be a listener, to listen and not just be a talker. And another commentary says that when you listen with the ear, the emphasis of a hearing of the ear is to say that you shouldn't miss a word. Sometimes we listen with one ear, but we don't really hear everything. We hear as much as we feel we need to hear to get the idea, and then we go on to the next thing. No, you have to be attentive to hearing everything, because you can't allow even a nuance to be lost. Number 4, verbal articulation. Literally, it means arranging your lips. What does that mean? Simply, it means when you learn, you shouldn't learn with your eyes, with your thoughts, but learn with your mouth. Articulate, vocalize the words. I grew up in a schizophrenic environment, because when I went to yeshiva, in the morning we had Jewish studies, in the afternoon we had secular studies in elementary school. And our teacher in the morning, the rabbi who taught us, when we would read and we weren't moving our lips, he says, "Move your lips, say the words, vocalize the words. Don't just read it with your eyes." And then we got to the secular department, and someone would read the words with their mouth. He says, "Don't read with your lips, just read with your eyes." So we grew up in this schizophrenic environment. And nowadays, there's a lot of research that has been done that proves that when you vocalize the words, it helps for retention of the material, and it helps to absorb it, and retention of the material. You don't forget it easily. And that's mentioned in the Talmud very clearly. The Talmud tells a story of Beruria, the wife of Rabbi Meir, who was a great Talmudic scholar in her own right, which was unusual in those days, but she was singled out as one of the great scholars. And she saw a student of her husband studying without moving his lips. And she rebuked him, and she said, "What's going to happen is you're going to forget everything that you learned. You have to have your whole body involved in learning. The more senses you involve in learning, the more it will become part of you, and the more you will retain. So if you could dance while you're learning, that would even be better, if it wouldn't get in the way." So that's one thing about the articulation, verbal articulation. Another thing about speech, the Kabbalist and the Hasidic literature talks about how when a person understands a subject and then they articulate it, it enhances their understanding, because the source of speech in the soul is higher than the source of knowledge. Even though speech is just a mechanical thing, you would think, but it really has a deeper root in the soul, so that when you speak, it enhances your wisdom and enhances your emotions as well. If you love someone and then you tell them, "I love you," it adds to the love. It enhances it. Obviously, it has to be sincere. If it's not sincere, it doesn't do anything. But if it's sincere, it enhances the feelings and the wisdom. So in order for you to acquire the Torah, it's very important that you don't just read with your eyes and you say the words with your mouth. In fact, and according to Jewish law, there's a commandment to learn Torah. If you only read the Torah with your eyes, you cannot fulfill the mitzvah. Some say that this means to arrange your lips is more than just saying the words. It means you have to master the subject in a way that you could teach it to others. How do you know that you understand the subject if you can teach it to others and the others understand what you're saying, then you know you mastered it. If you just learn it and you think, oh, I think I understand it, oh, could you teach it to others? No, I don't think I can do that. That means you haven't acquired it yet. It doesn't make you a bad person. Don't think that if you didn't achieve all these things, you're a bad person. It just means that you didn't reach the highest level of acquiring this knowledge. Yes?
What if you're just thinking it in your mind? There's nothing in front of you, no print, and you're praying silently in your mind without moving your lips.
You have to use your mind. And he's not saying you shouldn't spend time just meditating, using your mind. Sometimes you just have to sit down and think before you start saying the words. But thinking alone is not enough. But it's not negating thinking. In fact, without thinking, you're saying words is just babbling.
But when you're thinking, you should be moving your lips also.
No, not necessarily. But sometimes you have to just think. But after the thinking, or before it, you say the words as well. Some commentators put a little of a moral twist over here. Arranging your lips as opposed to just writing, say the words, means that make sure your lips are clean. When it comes to Torah, it's important, if you want to study any other subject, any secular subject, you can have a filthy mouth, you could be a very immoral person, and you could still speak words of mathematics, of physics, of chemistry, of biology. There's no contradiction. Doesn't make it right, but it's not a contradiction to secular knowledge. But when it comes to Torah knowledge, the mouth that utters words that are not clean or not moral cannot be the same mouth that will utter the words of Torah. They're incompatible. So while people can do it, it's physically possible, it means that you're losing the real spiritual content of the words of Torah that you're learning. Then we have perception of the heart. Here's where we get into the part of learning that is more cerebral, more intellectual. That it's not enough to just read the words and have a basic understanding. You have an obligation to delve more deeply into it and apply the power of Bina. In Hasidic literature, we're told that the difference between Chachma, which is translated usually as wisdom, but it means conceptual knowledge, where you're just open to the knowledge. Someone is showering you with knowledge, but you're not analyzing it. Bina is where you start to develop the understanding of the knowledge. That is the next step. You have to then take the knowledge and tackle it and apply rigorous analytical powers to the subject at hand. If it's just that you have opened yourself to knowledge, but you're not really using your own mind to analyze things, then you're not going to acquire it. That's why in biblical literature, knowledge is often referred to as the lev, the knowledge of the heart. Everyone knows that it comes from the brain, but the idea of the heart is to emphasize the idea that it's not enough just to have the receptive part of knowledge, but you also have to have the active part of knowledge, just like the heart is constantly pumping blood. And also it has to come with the passion for truth. You can't just want to learn for the sake of learning and not looking for acquiring truth. And that is identified with a metaphor of the heart. The heart symbolizes passion. So a person can't just be dispassionate about the learning, even though when you look at scientists or great philosophers, it seems that they were dispassionate people just using their minds. When it comes to Torah, the mind is not enough. You have to also employ the heart. There has to be a passion for that pursuit of truth. And you'll never be satisfied with yourself until you reach that truth. Then we go into number 6, awe. When it comes to any other subject, you don't need to have awe of God in order to master the subject, to acquire the subject. But when it comes to Torah, you have to be endowed with awe of God, because Torah is divine wisdom. You want to connect to the ideas? Be my guest. You can be an atheist and you can still study Torah and understand the ideas. You want to connect to the divinity of Torah, to the real essence of Torah, you have to have this awe of God. You have to be feeling that the Torah that you're learning is God's Torah. It says that when Mount Sinai occurred, when the giving of the Torah at Mount Sinai, the people were trembling, they were perspiring, there was such awe by the experience. So the Talmud says that's how we have to study Torah now. We have to be filled with this awe. Now it's a major challenge to feel that way, but when we say the blessing for the Torah, if anyone got an aliyah, and they say the blessing beforehand, they say, "Blessed are you, God, notein haTorah," or nosein haTorah. What does that mean? Blessed are you, God, who gives the Torah. Not who gave us the Torah, but who gives us the Torah. Present tense. Why is it present tense? Because when we study Torah, God is giving the Torah to us anew, just like He gave it at Mount Sinai. And we have to try to feel that experience. Every time we study Torah, we can't have that feeling in our heads all the time, otherwise it would get in the way of our studying. But we have to have times in the day before we study Torah to try to feel that awe and to recapture that experience of Sinai. It was the most powerful spiritual experience that humanity ever had, and we have to try to recapture that. And that's how we recapture the divine element within Torah. Rashi says that when a person has awe and he feels his own insignificance in the presence of God, and that makes you receptive to Torah. Because Torah, it says Torah is likened to water. Just like water flows downward, same thing, Torah has come down to those people who are down below in the sense that they are humble. They're filled with awe and trepidation in the presence of God, so that humbles them. Then they become receptive to Torah. In the Amidah, the daily prayer that we say 3 times every day, 7 days a week, the end of the Amidah, the standing prayer, there's an appended prayer which says, "V'nafshi ka'afar l'kol tiheh," my soul shall be like dust. And right after that it says, "P'tach libi b'toratecha," open my heart to your Torah. What's the connection between the two? When a person is humble, then his heart is opened to absorb Torah. When a person is full of himself or herself, full of arrogance, I'm the scholar, I'm the great master of this Torah, then your heart is not open to Torah. And therefore you will not acquire truth. You'll acquire knowledge, you'll be able to get a job maybe as a rabbi somewhere, as a teacher, but you're not really getting knowledge, getting truth. You're distorting really what Torah is all about. But then the next thing is related is fear. At least that's one translation of it. Some commentaries say that this is talking about the teacher, respect for the teacher. Not fear, although when we were kids we had fear of some of our teachers because they used corporal punishment, and I got a spanking once from one of my teachers. A few years ago, something like 65 years ago. But I still remember it to this day. And I was one of the better students. So you can imagine what some of them had. So they had real fear of their teacher, but that's not what we're talking about. Fear means a sense of respect. The Talmud tells a story that a certain sage, whose name was Rabbi, before he would start his lecture, he would crack a joke, because the students were so filled with awe of their teacher that they couldn't learn. You know, having awe is a very good thing, but if you have too much awe, too much fear, too much trepidation, it's going to just plug your brain. You're not going to be able to absorb anything. So in order to lighten the atmosphere, he would crack a joke, they would all laugh, and then they sat with respect, but they were receptive to his words. But you have to have that respect in order to absorb things. There's a story in the Talmud, a discussion of the Talmud. In Hebrew, for those who are familiar with Hebrew, know there's a word, et. And it appears thousands of times. And if you ask what is the translation of it, there is no real translation. Like in the very first verse of the Torah, Bereshit, in the beginning, Bara Elokim, God created, et hashamayim, the heavens, ve'et haaretz, and the earth. You take the words et out, it translates the exact same way. So the Talmudic sages realize that the word et does have some connotation. It means those things that are subordinate to the main thing. Like there's the heaven, and then there is everything subordinate to the heaven. The stars, the sun, the moon, the earth, and everything subordinate to the earth. So this rabbi, whose name was Shimon Hoamsoni, developed a thesis, maybe to get his PhD, to take every time the Torah used the word et, and to find what it really meant. What is it referring to? What subordinate thing it's referring to? Until he got to a verse that said, Et Hashem Elokecha Tira, you shall fear God your God. And the word et is there. So that would have to mean that there's something else that you have to fear like God. And he said that couldn't possibly be. So you know what he said? He ripped up his whole dissertation. He said, if this is wrong, then all my interpretations must have been wrong. And he said that the same way I will get reward for all of my efforts of interpreting the word et, I will get reward for abandoning that and for throwing it out. How many PhD candidates would do that today? Or how many professors at the end of his career realized that all his theories were wrong and admit it? It takes a lot of courage to do that. Rabbi Akiva, the greatest of sages, said to him, no, you're not wrong. He says, the words Et Hashem Elokecha Tira, God your God you shall fear, includes Torah scholars, that you shall fear them, fear meaning have reverence and respect for them, just like you have respect for God, because they are representing God's teachings. So you have to show reverence for them. And that's what this word fear means, reverence for the teacher. If a person doesn't have respect for the teacher, I know kids would throw spitballs at the teachers in my days. If they didn't like the teacher, you're not going to learn very much. You're not going to absorb very much. Some say fear is a little different. Fear means if you make a mistake in some subjects, it's no big deal. It's your lack of knowledge. So what? It's not going to hurt anyone. I remember once there was a professor at UB, professor of pharmacology, who failed a student because they got the wrong answer on a test. The decimal point about the amount of medicine needed was in the wrong place. And he said, why'd you fail me? Got one thing wrong. He said, yeah, that could have killed who knows how many people. If you would administer that drug based on your decimal point, it could be deadly. So if a person has that knowledge that your mistake could cause harm to people, then you'll be afraid of just treating the subject very lackadaisical. You're going to be more serious about it, realizing, and that's true of Torah, if you misrepresent the Torah, you're misrepresenting divine truth, and that's not a light matter. Then the next one is modesty. I mentioned before that awe causes a person to be humble. So what's the difference? The difference is there are two types of humility. There's one type of humility where you realize God's awesome greatness, and in presence of God, you're a nobody. But what about in relation to other people? Do you also have humility vis-a-vis others? You know, they tell this joke about the rabbi Yom Kippur gets up in his sermon and he says, you know what, I'm a nobody, in God's presence, I'm worthless, I'm a sinner and this. And then the cantor sees that the rabbi is showing so much humility, so he gets up and he says, you know what, in spite of all my talents, I'm a nothing before God and everything. And then one of the congregants gets up and he says, I'm a nobody, and the rabbi turns to the cantor and says, who does he think that he's a nobody? Sometimes you could be humble because you're thinking about God, and in presence of God, everyone is nothing. But when it comes to other people, you could be very, very arrogant. They tell, again, this is I don't know if it's a joke or it actually happened. There was one person who would lay down on the entrance of the synagogue and he would cry out the words that I mentioned before, "My soul is like dust for everyone to trample upon." And everyone was like awe-stricken from this holy man, and people would never go around him until one wise guy decided he's inviting me to step on him, so he stepped on him. And he started screaming, "How dare you step on me?" He says, "But that's what you said. I'm like dust." He says, "Yes, but I'm holy dust." So you can be humble in relation to God, but in relation to other people, you can feel, I'm better than you. Maybe I'm more humble than you, but you're actually very arrogant. That's what I mean by this second type of modesty. But why it's important to have this type of humility, because then you'll be eager to learn from others. Besides being receptive to the divine of Torah, which we discussed before, you will be willing to learn from others, as it says in Ethics of the Fathers. Who is truly a wise person? The one who learns from everybody, even somebody who knows much less than you, but there's always something you can learn from somebody. And likewise, if you're humble, you will say, "I don't know," or "I was wrong." How many people are willing to say that, especially if you're a scholar, if you're an advanced scholar, and someone asks you a question, and you realize you're wrong, and you're willing to admit it? I was in Australia, so I met someone there, a rabbi there, a great scholar, and he tells me, "I was a student of your father." He said, "I never had a teacher like your father." I said, "Why?" He said, "Before, my father would give a lecture. You see, the lectures were like original insights, interpretations of the Talmud. My father was a brilliant Talmudic scholar and very creative intellectually. And before he would give the lecture to the whole student body, he would call over 2 or 3 of the best students, and he would discuss it with them, what his thesis was. And this one student said, "I argued with your father," and I said your father's explanation was not the right one, and I gave a different explanation. Now, my father had prepared a whole lecture based on his thesis, and he got up in the class and he says that I intended to explain it one way, but that was wrong, and this is the right explanation that I heard from this student. He says, "No other teacher that I had was able to do that." I know that for a fact, because I remember once I was in a new class, and the teacher was a genius, and he said something, and I would sit behind him, and I was afraid, intimidated by him to ask questions. But once he said something, I was convinced he was 100% wrong, that it is a place in the Talmud that contradicted what he was saying. So I interrupted his talk, and I said to him, "How do you reconcile what you said with this and this passage in the Talmud?" And I could see the look on his face that I got him. But instead of saying, "You're right," and then ending the lecture, he turns around to the other students and he says, "Did you hear what he asked?" And he repeated my question, and I could see the wheels are turning and he came up with a brilliant answer. I think he was wrong about his answer, but he squirmed out of it. So that was not the modesty. I'm not going to mention any names, of course, but that was not the modesty that was required, that if he knew he was wrong, he should have said, "You're right," and end the lecture at that point, unless he had something else to say. But that requires a certain type of modesty and humility, not just in the presence of God, but in the presence of other people as well. Then the final one, the 8th one that we'll discuss today, is joy. There's an expression in the book of Psalms, Oz v'chedva b'mkomo. There is strength and rejoicing in God's place. Joy is associated with the divine. Depression is associated with impurity. And I'm not talking about clinical depression. That's something that's a physical illness. But when a person has a self-induced sense of depression, they wallow in their own, whatever it is that causes them to be depressed, they are distancing themselves from God. God loves joy. He loves life. Joy and life go together. And therefore, if you want to absorb the divinity of Torah, you have to develop a sense of joy. And this is especially true with the month we're in right now. We're in the month of Adar, which is, Talmud says, when you enter into this month, you increase in your joy. That even if you don't feel the joy, start singing and dancing and create that joy. But that's not only a good thing in its own right, it's a healthy thing, but it also allows you to be receptive to the divine. There's an expression in the Talmud that a king could break through barriers. If you are a king and you are living in a country where you have to travel from point A to point B, let's say you have to go out to a battle and you have to take a circuitous route, you can break through people's fences and just go straight to wherever you have to go. That's the power of a king. He can break through fences. There's a Hasidic maxim that paraphrases that and says, joy breaks through fences. That when a person who has joy is like a king has no restrictions. He has power. Whether it's good power or bad power is immaterial. But a king has power. When a Jew has joy, you are a king. You're a master of your life. And you could break through every barrier. And therefore, if there's a mental barrier that prevents you, a mental blockage that prevents you from learning and absorbing and being receptive, the joy breaks through those barriers. And that's the difference between Torah study and every mitzvah. Every mitzvah you do, of course, if you do it with joy, it enhances the mitzvah. But Torah study is supposed to be the greatest source of joy and delight. People who have experienced every type of physical, sensual, hedonistic pleasure, when they got attracted to the study of Torah, they discovered that Torah was more enjoyable to them than any other pleasure they ever had. It's the greatest pleasure. Just like people who are more sophisticated will get more pleasure from a beautiful concert, going to the Philharmonic and listening to the cello played by Rabbi and others. They get more pleasure in that than by eating a good meal, because it's a more spiritual type of pleasure, a more abstract and type of pleasure. The same way, when you learn Torah and you really learn Torah with joy, the Torah itself is the greatest source of joy, and it gives you the power to break through every barrier. Other commandments are enhanced by joy, but Torah is synonymous with joy and delight. And if anyone has any questions before we start singing and dancing, please feel free. Any Zoomies?
Rabbi, you mentioned about the 48. The 49th step, is that?
The 49th is combining all 48.
Okay, but is that what they talk about, the age to come, the Messianic time? There'll be a level, the 49th level?
The 50th level
that's
we'll
the
reach.
50th.
That's the 50th level.
Okay. That's the ultimate.
Yeah. Yes?
Could you give us the Hebrew words for all of these, please?
Yeah.
I mean, for each of the steps.
Yeah, we should have put the Hebrew down.
Would be wonderful.
Okay, the first one, if I can remember, is Talmud. It's the same as in English. The second one is Arichas Shmias Ha'ozen.
Shmias Ha'ozen?
Right, listening of the ear. I'll put it in Hebrew. It's Hebrew script. Talmud. Pinas Halev.
Thank you, Rabbi. Have a nice day, and everybody.
We're done.
Look how terrible technology is. Can't even erase something.
Is this the eraser right here? Is this the eraser right here?
Yeah, I got it.
Iraq.
That is the next one. Next one is Simcha. Simcha. Okay, Talmud, Shmiat HaOzen, Arichat Sfatayim, Binat Halev, Ema, Yira, Anava, and Simcha. Those are the
Assign the page is very hard to read.
You know, if someone should invent something called a pencil, a thing called paper.
Old school. Maybe it'll make a comeback. Like,
Yeah.
like vinyl, right?
Any questions here? Let me see the chat. Oh, there's in the chat.
Thank you, Rabbi.
How can we obtain copies of the outlines you are using? And the answer is the link to the PDF is on the chat. Is in the chat. Okay. Was it?
Oh, okay.
Okay, there will be CDs available next week. Next week. So if you come here in person, you'll get your CD.